Hello there, I'm Geraldine Doogue. Welcome to a Compass dinner on a social issue that just refuses to go away despite the best efforts of many on various sides of politics. And it's an issue on which people have very strong opinions. There are people pro it and people against it. I'm talking, of course, same-sex marriage and maybe a whole host of Australians who run right down the middle, who just don't know quite what they think. So with me tonight are people who are going to flesh out the various nuances of this debate. Bishop Rob Forsyth, the Reverend Nathan Nettleton, Geoff Thomas, Father Frank Brennan, Julia McCrossan and Dennis Altman. Thank you all for joining us. And just to kick us off, I'm going to go around the table and I would like each of you to make your case about same-sex marriage. Geoff, please do start to eat, by the way.
Well, look, I grew up homophobic. I come from a very working-class family in Richmond in Melbourne. My father hated gays. Everyone around me hated gays. About 6 years ago, my dear wife, just before she passed away from cancer, handed me the phone one night and said, your son's got something to tell you. So he told me that he said, Dad, I'm to tell you that I'm gay. So I was actually taken from the sideline into the game, if you like.
Geoff Thomas, by his own admission, grew up blokey. The army and later a trade did nothing to challenge his self-proclaimed homophobia. But when Geoff's 32-year-old son Nathan finally found the courage to come out, Geoff was forced to re-evaluate his attitude towards homosexuality. His recent appearance on Q&A catapulted Geoff into the public eye when he revealed his personal experience to the nation.
This is one other aspect about this discussion, is the ripple effect. We're not just talking about gay people, we're talking about their extended families here.
Yeah. But so look, in essence for you, it was a very personal metamorphosis, change of mind.
Absolutely. And when you look at it in its simplest form, and I'll say this, religion doesn't own marriage in this country. Australia's a secular society. We have a situation in Australia where the only people, essentially, that can't get married are gays and lesbians. In Australia. It's unbelievable.
OK. Frank Brennan, what's your view on it?
Well, I'm a Catholic priest, so I'm not married and I don't have a life partner, so that makes me an expert, I suppose.
Certainly the Catholic Church often thinks so. Jesuit priest Frank Brennan is Professor of Law at the Australian Catholic University and comes from a long line of Catholic lawyers. He shot to prominence in the late 80s and 90s when the landmark Mabo and then Wick native title cases were before the High Court, drawing attention to Aboriginal social justice and land rights issues. Frank Brennan has never shied away from tackling tough social issues, and he's an outspoken advocate for human rights in Australia.
But I think, well, I'd agree with Geoff that religion doesn't own marriage in this country, but I'd say that, I mean, I'm a Catholic priest, I'm part of a worshipping community for whom we have a sacramental notion of marriage, that it's the union of a man and woman for life, open to the bearing and procreation and nurturing of each other's children.
You once said to me that the trouble with not being able to marry as a Catholic priest was that it did not allow you the intimacy that called you to account. And I've never forgotten, I think it's a beautiful phrase. Why did you come up with that?
I came up with it because I've seen it in married couples and others who have life partners where there is the intimacy, the love, but where they can correct each other. And I've often thought to myself, well, I go at home at night after pontificating around the nation, and there's just not the same thing there. OK.
Nathan?
My own view is kind of twofold here. And as a Baptist, I have a strong commitment to the separation of church and state, and therefore to the state not privileging any particular religious view, even mine. We actually need to look at it in terms of justice, of compassion, of equality for all people. And so I think the case would need to be made that allowing same-sex marriage would actually be detrimental to the community in some way before I would argue that the state should legislate it against it.
Reverend Nathan Nettleton firmly believes his unorthodox career pathway has been the perfect preparation for Christian ministry. He's had a failed marriage, was kicked out of Bible college, and drove a truck for a living before being ordained a Baptist minister in 1994. Many years on, he's remarried and is the pastor at the South Yarra Community Baptist Church in Melbourne.
For myself, I actually support it and would be willing to conduct a same-sex wedding were such things allowed.
And did you always think this?
Oh, no. No, I didn't. I began as quite homophobic and quite hostile to any form of acceptance of gay people in the church.
Julie.
When I left school and went to university, it was 1972. In 1972, male homosexuality was a criminal offence, and it stayed that way in the state I lived in, New South Wales, until 1984. It stayed that way in Tasmania till 1997. So when I left school, a Christian school, and went to university, it was bad, it was mad, and it was also against God's will.
Journalist, lawyer, comedian and Christian Julie McCrossan was advocating for marriage equality for same-sex couples as far back as the late 90s, when it wasn't a headline-grabbing issue. What motivated her then, as it does now, is her experience of family. For 16 years, she's been in a lesbian relationship. In that time, she's helped raise her partner's 2 children from a former marriage.
So I look at this discussion about whether we have access to the institution of civil marriage in exactly the same way as I looked at the discussion about whether it was a mental illness or whether it was a crime. Rational, caring, nice people like Rob Forsyth or Frank Brennan, two men.
You seem pretty normal to me.
Two men for whom I have the highest respect. It was just those sort of people who said it needs to stay a criminal offence and it needs to stay a mental illness.
And you were recognising in yourself that at that point, we should say, that you were homosexual?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and it was a terrible burden. My whole adult life, we've been fighting just for equality, and fundamentally, access to civil marriage is about equality before the law.
What does marriage, actually marriage itself, mean to you, Bishop Rob Forsyth?
Marriage for a man and a woman is a different order of reality than a committed, sanctioned partnership of 2 men and 2 women. And that to call them by the same name is confusing. And I think the fundamental difference is that the marriages it's inherited from the past is particularly about preserving the connection between biological parents and children, not only, but that's its main public good.
Robert Forsyth was raised a Methodist, but as a young man, after much soul-searching, he became an Anglican. He studied at Moore Theological College in the early 1970s, raised a family and was appointed Anglican Bishop of South Sydney in 2000. He is outspoken in his opposition to same-sex marriage, arguing that marriage has always been and must remain exclusive to a man and a woman.
I have certain views as a Christian minister which go beyond that, but I'm thinking of as a public policy question. The state should not be interfering in these matters, and so if you change it, you're going to be changing, in my view, the whole connection between biological parents and their children.
OK, hang on. Can I just let Dennis have his say?
Well, in a sense, I agree with everybody, which is very odd.
It's a worry, though.
It is a worry.
And I'm invited for that.
I mean, my position is simply that I don't think the state should define the way in which people enter into lifelong partnerships. And we make a clear distinction between what people who believe in certain religious teachings may choose to do, according to the precepts of those religions, and what the state regulates. And in response to Julie, I'd say, I don't actually feel what you feel. I've had a partner for 20 years. I think our partnership is stronger precisely because we haven't had to depend upon state and church to legitimise it. I'm very proud of that. I don't feel the need to grovel to bishops or priests or an appallingly bogan Prime Minister to get her approval.
Professor Dennis Altman grew up at a time when homosexuality was illegal. As a Fulbright scholar in the 60s, he worked with leading gay activists in the United States and was at the forefront of the gay rights movement back in Australia. Today, he's Professor of Politics at Melbourne's La Trobe University. He's spoken, written and published widely on gay liberation, but doesn't see marriage equality as central to the fight against homophobia.
The first order of business is at the moment, as we talk here tonight, there are young kids out there who are homosexual, who are contemplating suicide because of the ongoing and vicious prejudice.
4 times more likely to attempt suicide.
Exactly. And huge amount of bullying and huge amount of victimisation still. And we look at what is going on in many parts, particularly of Africa, and the role that churches are playing in fostering criminal homophobia. Homophobia that leads to people actually being killed, tortured, victimised. That, to me, is a prime issue. It is a prime issue that people who are religious need to face up to. And this is why I think Julie and I fundamentally disagree, not about the outcome, not about equality, but about what the really crucial issues about recognition of us as equal people are. That's what we should be talking about.
I do want to just quiz the men of faith here a little bit more about why it seems to matter to people of religion so much.
In the New Testament, the Lord Jesus Christ, when asked a question about marriage, goes back to the primeval text in Genesis, I think it's the 2nd chapter. A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. The word marriage is not used there. In fact, the word marriage is not used often in the Bible at all. But the notion of one flesh, that God made us male and female, as Jesus said, personally, I believe that it's God's will that men and women form a new kinship in which children are possibly to be born. I think you can be totally pro-gay, but still believe that marriage is a different order from a gay relationship. In other words, inviting a gay person into a marriage changes marriage irrevocably. It's not like there's a thing which stays the same and you're being excluded from. The thing itself will be changed because it's about men and women.
Rob, can I just ask you, why can't you allow the state to change the Commonwealth Marriage Act so that people who wish to have a civil marriage to go to a civil ceremony...
Sure.
Just to finish, because there's 65% of Australians right now don't go to church, synagogue or mosque, and then you can deny a religious ceremony.
It's not about ceremonies, not for us. My own personal view, I mean, the view about marriage is for all marriages, not just for Christian marriages. You're one flesh, man and woman, whether you've never heard of God or you're atheist. It's not a special Christian privilege. It's that marriage, it's
one of the struts of society.
Yes, and I don't know, and why, here's the question I've got to ask is, what's at stake in this debate is, what is marriage really about? What is this thing? We've inherited it. We didn't invent it. We all woke up and there it was. And what's it about? And how much can we change it before we've changed what it really is?
I think you're on very thin ground there, Bishop.
I need to say something here.
No, Nathan, just let Nathan first, and then Jeff, I'll come to you.
Tell me why I'm on thin ground, Nathan.
I think you're on thin ground in arguing that there's been one concept of marriage and it's been unchanging and we've simply inherited it.
I haven't argued that.
When you argue that if we do this, we will change the meaning of the word marriage, we've been changing the meaning of the word marriage progressively
you've misheard me.
for generations.
That's not my argument. My argument is not that. My argument is, at the heart of what the word marriage points to is a deep reality to do with husband, wife and children, which cannot be reproduced in a gay marriage, not because gay people are bad, but because they're not a man and a woman.
This is a very shallow argument. We know that gay people have biological children. We know that gays and lesbians adopt children. We know that they foster children. And we know statistically that they're considered to be good parents.
I think part of it is that for a lot of religious people, I think they might say, well, we're happy to tolerate, we become more tolerant, we're happy to be more respectful, but here we're being expected to endorse what they view as a lifestyle or what they view as a mode of relating which they think is different from that in their own marriage relationship.
But you see, people used to sincerely believe it was a mental illness. They sincerely did it. When I was a young woman at university in the early 70s, I knew men who went to Macquarie Street and medical specialists gave them electric shocks while they looked at pictures of men. Aversion therapy, it was called. This was considered a professional practice, and I just don't see why this isn't just a continuation of prejudice.
But Julie, if you look back through history, as I've done for preparing for this, in all the incredible changes of form of marriage, marriage as property, marriage as dynasty, etc., there's never been, to the best of my knowledge, man to man or woman to woman. It has always been a man and a woman. And so why should that change now?
Well, Jerry, why should women be allowed to have an education? Why should women be allowed to use contraception? Why should women be allowed to work? If we go through the history of the world, right now is a tiny fragment of human history. And you, really, Jerry, why should women be able to be presenters on television? When we were young...
How is that relevant?
Let me finish.
How is that relevant?
Well, what I'm saying is fundamental institutions in society change progressively. That's what this is all about. This is about progressive social change. There is now an acknowledgement it's not unlawful, it is normal.
Just get Dennis is itching to say something.
I'm finding this very difficult, actually, to say anything. I was going to go back. I mean, of course, historically, I think marriage was based upon the subordination of women to men. I mean, and you see, I find this very strange. I'm sitting at this table as the only feminist, I think, who actually... No. Well, I think I am. I mean, there was a tradition among feminists of saying we want to get away from marriage because precisely of its historical origins. And I think, Rob, you're absolutely right. Yes, it was about men knowing that they were the biological parents of the children. What worries me about it is let us take the reverse of your position. As increasing numbers of kids grow up with single mothers or in mixed families or with lesbian and gay parents or in all sorts of changing family relationships, because the world is changing very rapidly, as Julie's been pointing out, what happens to those kids with people like you constantly saying, but really, the only acceptable form...
I'm not saying
Well, no, you are.
I'm
sorry, you're trying to have it both ways, and you can't have it both ways. I've actually given you a solution which is pull the church out, which means stop lobbying the government to enforce your views. And in that sense, I'm totally with Jeff. I mean, this is a secular society. It's a secular country. It's becoming less and less so as we fund more and more school chaplains, which I find deeply distasteful.
I'm not asking him to enforce my views
Yes,
because
you
it's
are.
religious. No, I'm not. I'm trying to understand what the social utility. I'm not trying to give a religious argument. What is a social...
But
what is
your
a liberal
argument in the
secular
end
society?
falls back on a biblical interpretation of a never-changing...
No, it doesn't.
It falls... Take it back to Genesis 2.
No, I did not. I did not.
This argument is always about religion.
No, it's not. You asked me for my...
And it's a legal... It's a legal issue.
But you can't have both. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, surely, are they?
Exactly.
I'd be the last person, and gay people and lesbian people, the last people that's to say that the Catholic Church shouldn't be able to marry people or have its own rules about marriage.
Exactly.
What we're talking about is a change in law in Australia that treats, at the end of the day, everybody the same.
I just have to make this point. The institution of marriage is a flexible and muscular institution that has changed throughout history, and it can absorb this tiny proportion of the population. Gay and lesbian people...
This is a big structural shift, Julie. You think it can cope with that?
Oh, I think
You've got no doubt about it.
I've got no doubt, Jerry. We're reinforcing the core values.
There are two views of marriage at the table, and I'll put them out. One is that marriage is fundamentally about relationship between the partners.
Adults.
Yes, adults. I've heard that very eloquently put by Julie. I respect that.
Yep.
Another is marriage is that plus the structure of childbearing, whether in fact it happens or not. That's what Frank and I are saying. And frankly, those two structures lead to different answers to this question.
Can I respectfully ask Julie, if you and Melissa were married tomorrow, do you think there would be any entitlement by the state or interfering do-gooders or whatever to say to you and Melissa, no, whatever the developments in technology, you cannot create your own child just by using material from the ova of each of you?
Look, I don't... Can I just talk about my actual life, not a fantasy life?
No, but he has posed you a question. I think that's important, Julie.
Well, why I'm wary of it, Jerry, is that, with due respect to Frank, he's representing the Catholic Church, and the current Catholic Church has very passionate views about interference with the creation of children, to the extent that you still don't support contraception. I don't want to be drawn into an arcane argument about whether 2 over.
Well, I believe
Please let me finish, because when I met Melissa just nearly 16 years ago, the children were 3 and 6. It is absolutely clear from research as well as my own direct observation that stability and consistency and repetition is good for children, and that the loving partnership between Melissa, myself and their father, Michael, we have worked together as a team, mutually respectful, with the best interests of the children at heart. And there is no question in my mind that fidelity is a positive good for children. It really is. And I do think my views have been influenced by the experience of child rearing.
OK, so since we are talking about children, last week on Compass, we interviewed 3 groups of gay couples who all wanted to get married. And one of them said that her child turned to her and said, "Why can't you get married?" Now, I just wonder, Rob Forsyth, how would you answer that child?
Because I'm not in love with a man. If it was a woman.
That's what you'd say to a child who's being raised, if you think about it.
With 2 mothers? What?
Yeah, if a child came to you and said, "I've got 2 mothers, why can't they get married, Bishop Forsyth?"
I'd say because marriage is for man and woman. It's as simple and as difficult as that.
But a bright child would say, "But here I am, Bishop Forsyth. I'm here.
Yes, and who is your?
I've been born."
And I'd say, who is your biological partner?
You would not say that to a child. Don't tell me you'd say that to a child.
No, but the question is, who is that biological father has a stake in that child? He has a right over that child, a care, a responsibility of that child. We recognise that immediately. You can't. It's the one right that the state cannot interfere with. It cannot take children away except in extreme cases. I'm a conservative, I'll admit that. I wouldn't even mind if there was something called gay marriage, just one thing, one word, a new institution that mimicked marriage and everything else except it wasn't called marriage.
But Rob,
I'd be happy.
It's happening.
Julie, I think that if the law was to change so that it was still called marriage, the distinction that exists today would still exist in people's minds. That is, marriage would just become wider to include 2 kinds of marriage.
Yes.
And that was still, in other words...
But that's OK.
No, it's not OK. You'll never get the situation that you long for, that a gay relationship, not full acceptance, is regarded as the same as... But my feeling is they'll still say, that's marriage and that's a different kind of marriage.
What do you think will happen if it does occur? What will change or not? Dennis?
Look, I have no doubt that same-sex marriage is going to happen. I mean, in a sense, it seems to me this entire conversation will be looked back as a strange piece of early 21st century nostalgia. There's a study that's been done in the Netherlands, which has had same-sex marriages for a while. One could say not long enough for us to be sure, but I think the reality is not very much changes. The evidence suggests that there's virtually no impact on the larger society.
Rob?
I don't know the future. Maybe that in 100 years' time, look back with horror. I don't know. A friend of mine, I mentioned I was coming to this, and he's a fairly liberal, progressive kind of Christian guy, but he said, if this has changed, I'll feel my relationship with his wife has been changed by the law. He felt somehow that, although happily married, that somehow the change would change, and there are those who feel a grief if this happens. Now, I hope that you are all right. I hope that happens is all for the best. But I must say, I'm not optimistic.
OK. Julie?
For people of my generation, it would matter deeply to me. I would feel like some form of internal furniture would finally lock in an IKEA sort of a way into place. And I feel deeply about this, Geraldine, and I assume it's because I was traumatised. I believe change will happen, and I think it's going to happen reasonably quickly now. and for two fundamental reasons. One is because something in the order of 10 to 14 comparable countries internationally have already done it. Spain, Portugal and so on. They have actual marriage, not civil union. But fundamentally the reason I think it will happen is because of Jeff's story. Homosexuality is a bipartisan issue. It turns up in all sorts of families, and often people don't change their views until they know someone they love within their family, and suddenly it's not an issue, it's about Jim or Susan, and that's what shifts people.
Frank?
I remain of the view that the Blair government got it right in the United Kingdom 6 years ago with civil unions. I mean, if it comes to pass, yes, I mean, people like Julie and Melissa will feel that this is a better country to live in, and Jeff will be happy for his son, and I, for one, will say, well, that's a good thing. But I think there'll be ongoing issues for us as a society, particularly in terms of the place of religious communities.
Nathan?
If we've got people knocking on the door saying, we've been excluded from this institution that values fidelity and we want in, anything that we do that actually says yes to the valuing and endorsing of fidelity has to be something that strengthens fidelity.
Jeff?
Well, for me, I think the sensibilities of some religious people will be offended, and I don't think it'll impact on their lives essentially one bit. I think a lot of gay couples will finally realise that they're treated the same as everybody else in this society. I think their children will gain the respect that they currently lack.
All right, look, we could go on and on and on, but it's just been a fabulous discussion, and I know that some of you have really laid yourself out, and I respect that. So thank you all. Dennis Altman, thank you to you. Julie McCrossan, Father Frank Brennan, Jeff Thomas, Reverend Nathan Nettleton and Bishop Rob Forsyth. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for Compass for dinner tonight.
Thanks, Jerry.
That was absolutely...
How are you going to win it?
I don't...